Good afternoon, everybody. Charles Moscowitz here. Monday through Friday, I'm trying to do this program live on YouTube, of course, and our other subscribers. And my guest is David Wemhoff. David is an attorney. He is an author. He is the author of John Courtney Murray, Time, Life, and the American Proposition. David, thanks for joining us this afternoon. Can you hear me?
You're breaking up.
All right, let me just move this back a little bit. Is that better?
That is a little better.
Yeah, now I'm getting some problems from your end. Speak into the mic.
Okay,
There
how's
you are.
this? Better?
Excellent. Really good. All right. First of all, I mean, I note that you're from South Bend, Indiana. It seems like there's a lot of intellectual ferment in your part of the world between yourself and my friend Dr. E. Michael Jones, and now your mayor there, Pete Buttigieg. It's just it's amazing what's emanating from your town in Indiana. So that's pretty interesting to me.
Who would have thought that Indiana would be the source of so much controversy and drama in the United States? But it is ground zero, I believe, in a very important conflict.
Indeed, it is. And I approach the subject, which is the moral authority and the faith of the Catholic Church, and what you argue has happened to it in the 20th century, starting in the 1950s. And I'm with you on it. My approach, of course, is not as a Catholic. I happen to be a Jew, but as such, and as a traditional conservative believer, I hold a lot of hope and stock in a Roman Catholic Church that finds its moral footing, and that is a moral avatar for the world. It's a universal church, and I look to it to be Catholic and to be moral and to take its position as this great moral force. And I think that I speak probably for many, if not most Jews, at least not those other than those who are revolutionaries on the left, of course. I don't speak for them. But your book does get into this event occurring around this priest, John Courtney Murray, and his what I view as somewhat of a change agent, and his alliance with Henry Luce, who of course was the editor and publisher of Time, Life, and the very influential magazine in the 1950s. So, David, give us a thumbnail, if you will, of your thesis in your book.
Well, the book is John Courtney Murray, Time, Life, and the American Proposition. And what it is an historical study of the doctrinal warfare program that was developed and implemented by the United States government in conjunction with the U.S. media. And what you have to understand is that in America, the media often works with the government, often works with the banking and the intelligence agencies to put forth a certain narrative, to put forth a certain ideology. During the Cold War, especially the early days of the Cold War, as my book recounts, the Americans targeted the Catholic Church because the Catholic Church is a very large institution with branches really in every town or almost every town on the globe. So that's a huge circulatory system with its heart at Rome and the Vatican. And if you can get the leadership to agree with your narrative, or if you get the leadership of the Catholic Church to agree with your ideology, or to approve your ideology, then you've got a very strong asset in your favor to try and control and manipulate the world. So that is what the book is essentially about. And what the Americans were doing is to get the Catholic Church leadership through John Courtney Murray to adopt as good in principle the American system of social organization. That American system of social organization I call the American ideology, because it is an ideology, but it is also liberalism with a capital L. And the heart of liberalism is really in the First Amendment, because the First Amendment says that you don't have an established religion, which means that you don't have a state church, but more importantly, that you don't have a state religion by which the laws and the public policies are to be evaluated. Secondly, it says, the First Amendment says you have freedom of religion, which means that you can belong to any religion you want or no religion at all, and the government can't force you to do anything in that regard, to join a religion or not join a religion, which means that no religion is protected, which means no church is protected, which means all the churches are out there running around, trying to keep their numbers up and not tick off the really powerful people. And those are the people who own the press, because in the First Amendment, the press is protected from government interference, and it's privately owned. It is not owned by the government. It's owned by private interests, powerful private interests. And that press, as I detail in my book, works with the financial interests to go ahead and to advance this system of social organization around the world. And what that system of social organization does is it allows for the accumulation in an effective and safe manner of an enormous amount of wealth in the hands of a few people, or a relatively small group of people. And I think the important words here, effectively and safely, allow that concentration of wealth. You don't know who the people are necessarily getting the wealth. They're kind of in the shadows. They're not in government, so they're kind of in the shadows. They live in their big estates. Right. And so how that works is that, okay, if we don't have a state religion, okay, then that means the churches don't really have any power. They don't have any power over the culture. And most importantly, they don't have any power to tell the rich people what they do is right or wrong. Oh, they can. I mean, go right ahead. Bishop Rhodes is the local bishop here in South Bend. Oh, I'm sure he could tell some of the bank owners here who are Catholic, don't do this or don't do that. And then he's going to see his credibility dry up, and he's going to see his contributions dry up.
Well,
that's the way it works.
They don't have any state power, but they have enormous power. And it seems to me that your analysis of the American prospect is correct in that we did implement this idea of a separation of church and state in the de facto sense. But then I don't think that necessarily means that we were lacking in faith. I think that the Declaration of Independence does make a direct reference to God. It doesn't make reference to specifically Jesus, but it does leave certainly all faiths in place. And that faith was kind of an assumed thing. Even the Constitution, it says it is ordained. That is a religious term. That means that there's a creator of the universe who sanctioned the development of this document, and that the document reflected the values of Christianity and for that matter, Judaism, but really Christianity. And that, while we didn't have like a state religion, whether it be Catholic or Protestant, nevertheless, I don't think that necessarily meant that the individual religions' powers were in any way diminished in the United States. They didn't have literal temporal power like the Roman Catholic Church has under Catholic kings, or that like maybe the Lutheran Church has in Sweden. I don't know, or state churches under Protestant control. But did that necessarily mean that the United States was therefore not religious or even atheist, or are we based upon, I would suggest, the Christian faith and in a small p, the Protestant faith?
Not at all. America is not based on any faith. It is not organized on any faith. There may have been some cultural remnants of some form of Christianity, and the founders knew that existed out there. You did have state churches in the various colonies. However, as time went on, in the 30 to 40 years after independence was won, those state churches ceased to exist.
Right, exactly. They withered away. You're right about that.
It has been a process over the last 240 years of this basically atheistic ideology, which has infiltrated all throughout society. And you can see it even now today in great high relief if you wanted to take a look at the whole situation of gay marriage and abortion and contraception. So what happens is the higher society comes to inform the lower, the public comes to shape the private. So the higher society was the U.S. Constitution, which had the First Amendment. And so that had the effect of gutting the power of the churches. And it took a while for that to happen, but it is happening, and it has happened, and that's the natural course of this.
Well, it kind of creates somewhat of a conundrum in that, on the one hand, I want to see the Catholic Church, I want to see Protestant churches, I want to see Judaism exercising their moral authority, their understanding of the covenant. In the case of Catholics, obviously, it's the covenant with Jesus. And I want to see that being done in a way that is of maximum influence in American society. But at the same time, I don't necessarily think that it would have been appropriate to have a state church on the federal level. And if they did have a state church on the federal level in the United States, it wouldn't have been the Catholic Church, because Catholicism really didn't enter into the American firmament until mass immigration in the late 19th, early 20th century. Neither did Judaism. I mean, it was a Protestant country, actually, at the time of the founding. So, it's just an interesting conundrum, because, where do you balance the fact that you do have churches and temples that want to exercise the moral authority over their own parishioners and over the society at large? But at the same time, is it a good idea to have a state church in the United States?
Every society up until 1776 had a state church.
Right.
Everybody recognized the importance of a state church as a check not just on the government, but also a check on the appetites of the powerful private interests. So that has been something that human nature, that human societies have seen since the beginning of time. It is a part of the natural law to have some sort of a state church. Pick your religion. It doesn't matter. Just pick a religion. But every society, all the way back to the Babylonians and the Egyptians, all had a state religion. That's an essential part and an understood part of human existence. Does America need a state religion? Sure, if it wants to stay in line with some sort of moral code. Otherwise, the moral code is going to be shaped by the rich and the powerful, by the elites. And you can always argue and say, well, that's always the way it is, all throughout societies, all throughout human history. That's always been the battle. But the Catholic Church has got a doctrine that says, well, you know what? The state church is supposed to be the Catholic Church. That is the divine positive law. That means every state is supposed to have the Catholic Church as the established church, and all the policies are to be based on the divine positive law, which is the Catholic religion. This is Catholic doctrine, it's Catholic dogma, and that is what the leadership of the Catholic Church jettisoned after John Courtney Murray. Now, I will tell you that that whole situation was boiling up for a very long time, and Americanism was really deeply in place in the church as early as the 1870s. And that was the idea that basically America got it right. The American system of social organization of no established church is the way to go. Without an established church, you end up with what you got now.
Well, I mean, I'm of a couple of minds on the topic. On the one hand, I want to see the Catholic Church be itself and be a state church. I understand that there is the temporal element of the Catholic Church. There's a Vatican, which is a physical entity, and that the Pope is the vicar of Christ. The Pope, essentially is Christ's representative on earth, and then his ministry, and the College of Cardinals is what instructs the Catholic flock and the Catholic kings. At the same time, the issue had already been somewhat resolved even before the United States was established in 1776 by Martin Luther. And that, in fact, the church had, in my understanding, maybe my history here is conventional, but the church itself had become very corrupted and had become under control of very wealthy people. And that, in a sense, what you're talking about is, I think, correct theologically, but it doesn't necessarily translate in a practical sense as a governing idea. However, I want to bring things to the situation with John Courtney Murray, because you refer to this, and I think accurately, as a conspiracy. And you point out that the Catholic Church, which up until that point viewed itself as the secular authority, was undermined by his ministry in conjunction with Henry Luce, who I think is Protestant, by the way, isn't he?
Henry Luce was a Presbyterian.
There you
The
go.
state, let me go back to something you said earlier. A state church is ultimately practical. It worked in Europe for a very long time.
Right.
You're Jewish, Israel's got a state church. It's
It
called
does.
Judaism. Every society understands
Well,
you
I'm
got to
talking
have
about
a
the United
state church.
States. I mean, look, Israel is a theocracy. Great Britain has a state church, the Church of England. I get that. But the United States was the exceptional nation in that regard. And I tend to think that I tend to believe in that. I mean, I don't necessarily want the United States to be either Catholic or Jewish or Protestant. I mean, at the same time,
Well, a lot of people agree with you on that because that basically guts the power of the religions. I'm looking at this from an objective point of view, and that basically guts the power of the religions. You got Mike Pence and Pete Buttigieg sitting there arguing about what it means to be a Christian. Well, where are the bishops? Well, they're just going to shut up because they're going to get money from everybody as long as they shut up.
Well, here's where I agree
You're
with you, David.
you're talking about conspiracy, okay? No,
Yes.
it really wasn't a conspiracy. Conspiracy has a dark, term to it. What you had happen is you had the elites in America decide we're going to spread this idea around the globe. They were very open about it. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was very open about it in his For Freedom speech on January 6, 1941. So was Henry Luce. Everybody was reading this and watching this. Everybody was doing it. The CIA is the tail on the dog. It doesn't wag the dog. I've got a dog, and I've watched him for many years now, and that tail does not wag the dog. The CIA, those guys get checks like everybody else who works for the government, and they carry out their little purpose. What you had was a very public effort to influence public opinion and public views because the belief was that the American system is better. And a lot of people agree with you. Boy, if we don't have a state religion, we can make all the money we want and do whatever we want. We're not going to be restricted by anybody. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows that, and it floats a lot of boats, Charles.
No, I understand that, and I think that we should be restricted and restrained by the moral authority of our respective churches, especially the Catholic Church. Now we're bringing things up.
Who's supposed to govern? Which view of God, which view of morality is supposed to govern?
Our governors should be influenced by their faiths, and that should be an issue that's discussed. But now we're bringing things up to the present time, and I would suggest the subversion. I only use the word conspiracy because that's what I heard you say with Peter Helland, because I watched that interview, very good interview, and good interviewer. And that is that you're talking about the advent of the globalists, the people that want to create this kind of world civilization that's amoral and that's anti-God, quite frankly, and that the churches and the synagogues, they've been infiltrated by this process. I mean, Judaism was the first to fall. I'll admit that, and it was the most vulnerable with the advent of a false Messiah in the 16th century, the 17th century, that perverted and corrupted the Jewish body. It's a poison that we still need to excise. We have a long way to go from doing that. I think that many of the Protestant churches came next, but the Catholic Church stood up against this as a stalwart because you had this universal influence, because you had this hierarchical structure with a pope and a college of cardinals. It was able to resist this infiltration by these amoral internationalists who, as you say, it's a combination of financial interests who operate outside of the view of the public, combined with political influences, and that they've become the ones who've taken the high ground in this country and in the world. But what happened is they finally did get their hooks into the Catholic Church. That's what I think your book is about, and that's where I'm with you 100% in terms of the deleterious and negative effects of that. So talk a little bit about exactly how that happened, how it is that, who was John Courtney Murray, why was he cavorting with Henry Luce, who was part of this internationalist view, and how did they actually get into the Catholic Church? How did they cross the citadel?
Well, what they did was they got the media touting a certain view of the world that was good, and the media was very, very powerful. And then they had John Courtney Murray come in as a priest with the theology to back it up. And he had the backing of Luce and other very big people in American society. This was after the Second World War, and America emerged the winner there. America had great moral clout. So America was held up as the great ideal. And so the leadership of the church looked at that, and they saw that, and they were subjected to all of this gigantic media bombardment through the magazines and the music and the films, and they said, America's got it right. But more importantly, the guys running the church, you touted how great, this leadership was in resisting this effort over the years, and that's only partly true, Charles. I mean, the reality is the leadership itself was becoming corrupt over a long period of time. If you're in a room, you start to breathe the bad air, or you start to breathe the air, and you start to take on the characteristics of those around you. And the societies were liberal, and so what was going on is the churchmen were themselves becoming liberal. Pius X saw this. Pope St. Pius X, he saw this coming. That's why he had the oath of modernity, or against modernism. He had people take that oath. He saw it seeping into the church. It was starting to corrupt the priests and the hierarchy. And the American prelates led the charge on that with the way that they were able to say, America's a good system of government. We ought to keep it. So you had people, within the church saying the American system of social organization was good. And then you had John Courtney Murray and this huge media blitz by Henry Luce and all the other American media to get the Catholic media to fall in line to say the same thing, that the American system of social organization is good and right. But most importantly, John Courtney Murray was the messenger. He was the envoy that came from the winners. And he was the envoy that went to Rome. And he said, hey, you guys can really have it good if you just go this way, if you accept our way of social organization. That was the message that was sent. And that was the message that the leadership of the church accepted, and that they understood what that meant, and so they went along with that viewpoint. Now, the reality is the doctrine has never changed. And that is what my book discusses, is how that doctrine never changed, how the efforts of Murray and Luce and the others were combated or fought by the likes of Father O'Connell and Monsignor Fenton.
Well,
but they only had so many resources. They only had limited resources to fight this, and the leadership wanted to go with the winners. And so that's what you have to this day. And that's what Pope Francis is. Pope Francis is an Americanist. He's totally Americanist. But I think out of America, he's for it.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that what might have also happened is something that I've heard Dr. E. Michael Jones make reference to with regard to the misinterpretation of the Vatican II Nostra Aetate doctrine and by Jewish leaders. And this is that basically, and this is how the ACLU operates. It's I would call it Fabian socialism. It came out of England in the late 19th century. Robert Morris and other thinkers, and that is to leave in place the language and leave in place the customs and leave in place the practices, but change the meaning of the words. In other words, like for Vatican II, they left in place all of the doctrines of the church because they knew they couldn't fight that. They couldn't challenge. People couldn't challenge that because that's there. It's irrefutable. So what they did was they either changed the interpretation of it, they misinterpreted it, they misreported it, and they got those falsehoods into the public using what you're talking about here, the psychological warfare, the press. And so thus we have the more, Americanist, if you will, interpretation of Vatican II and of Roman Catholic dogma. Wouldn't you say?
The Spirit of Vatican II. That's right. The Spirit of Vatican II was a term which I think was coined by Michael Nowak, who is now dead. He was a reporter for Time. It came out in the fall of 1964.
He was Catholic, by the way.
And he's talking about the Spirit of Vatican II, which was the spirit of Americanism. When
Right.
Dignitatis Humanae came out on December the 7th of 1965, what you had was a document which reaffirmed the traditional teaching of the church. But it didn't do so in a way that was entirely clear. So the interpretation of that was left up to a lot of Americanists, and that's what they did. They interpreted it the way they wanted to interpret it. Finally, about 1975, you had a Dominican, and I'm sorry, the name escapes me now, but Cardinal Wright wrote the preface, and he explained that this is the authoritative meaning of that document, Dignitas Humanae, which talks about the relationship of church and state, or more properly, religious liberty. And so what you have is you have Cardinal Wright trying to set the record straight on what the document is about, and get rid of all this commentary by John Courtney Murray in the Abbott version, which came out in 1966, 1967, right after the council.
Was John Courtney Murray a witting, conscious change agent? Did he want to change the faith and the practice of Catholicism?
Well, he wanted to change the doctrine. There's no doubt about that. I mean, he wanted to change the doctrine on church and state. And he and Luce both agreed that America was the ideal form of social organization. And so, yeah, he made that an effort. That was his effort for 20 years. The issue hinged around, on a theological basis, is what is a society supposed to follow? Just the natural law, which is an equivocal term, or the divine positive law, which is the Catholic faith? Father Connell and others said, no, the theology of our church and of the Catholic religion of Catholicism says it's the divine positive law. That's the Sermon on the Mount. That's Jesus Christ saying, I've come not to destroy the prophets and the law, but to fulfill them. Well, what did the prophets and the law do back in ancient Israel, Charles? They went around and they told the leaders how they were supposed to live and the public policies they were supposed to put in place in accordance with God's law. So what you had was you had Connell and Fenton saying, that's your duty. That's what every society is supposed to do. It's reflected in various encyclicals written by Leo XIII and others throughout hundreds of years of church history. It's reflected in church practice. It's reflected in the positive results of what happened in Europe, which state-established churches. And Murray said, no, you know what, America's got a better idea. And the leadership was glad to go with that, and they found a way to implement that by taking the documents and spinning them.
Yeah, and it's also reflected in the Mosaic Covenant, which has all of the moral and ethical precepts of the Torah as promulgated by the rabbis and the prophets, etc. So, you know, I think that I would suggest that Catholicism and Judaism share that particular approach, even if we may differ on theological questions, and that both faiths have been subverted by this relativistic and detachment from public life. But, you know, again, in America, it does bring up the conundrum of which faith would be the dominant, and I don't know how to answer that question. But I do want to see the Catholic Church right the ship of state and be Catholic, and other religions, the Protestant and my own faith, do the same as a way of sort of restructuring the moral and ethical code of Sinai, really.
Well, the Catholic religion teaches that you're supposed to convert countries and societies. Archbishop Hughes of New York in 1850 said, we got to convert America. He was criticized. He was in fear of his life. I read a biography of him that was published in 1866, within 2 years of his death. And they didn't even put that 1850 speech in there. There was so much anti-Catholic sentiment. Because once you establish Catholicism as the religion of a society, well, guess what? A lot of activity gets limited. Okay, and that upsets a lot of people. That doesn't mean other religions can't exist, and it doesn't mean that they can't continue to exist in that society, but their view of society, their view of morality is not going to be the final arbiter of what should be public policy and what isn't. You just simply can't have religion sit down and say, okay, what are we going to agree on this time or not agree on? Catholicism says, you know what, we got it all, we got it right, and that's what you got to establish. And if you don't do anything along those lines, you're not living the faith. And that's really the Catholic faith. So, I mean, if you want to, you know, from a Catholic point of view, it's very simple. The religion of the United States has got to be Catholicism. That's it. It's got to be it. From other people's points of view, I don't know. I can't speak to that, but I can tell you what the Catholic faith teaches.
Right, and as I say, I respect that, and I want the Catholic Church to continue its mission At the same time, I'm not sure that maybe I'm more liberal than you in this way, and I'm not Catholic. I'm hoping that the Catholic moral and ethical code and the Code of Sinai that really, I think, did found this republic somehow becomes predominant without necessarily the literal creation of a state church. But I don't know, look, I agree with you in that we're straying very far from that. And I'm not here to give some kind of an answer to it. I don't think it's realistic that the country is going to become Catholic, but especially given the fact that the Catholic Church itself doesn't seem to be Catholic anymore. I mean, you've got the America's most preeminent Catholic politician today, the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, promoting infanticide. So I don't know. I mean, I want to see the Pope and I want to see the Catholic Church reassert its authority over its own flock.
Well, I think about 33 AD, which is when Christ was crucified, it was probably a pretty impractical idea to think the Roman Empire would become Christian. But, within about, 350 years it did. It became Christian. So it takes a while. It takes a while. But what happened, as I recount in my book, is the likes of Father Connell and Father Fenton and a lot of other Catholics took your point of view. They said it's just not practical. We don't want to change it. We don't want to upset anybody. So they undercut their own argument. And when you undercut your own argument, you undercut your own belief system. And so that's how you get the Mario Cuomos of the world and the Governor Cuomos of the world. You get these people who sit up there and say, well, you know what? It's just not practical. So if it's not practical to institute the Catholic faith, and the Catholic faith must be wrong, and therefore we have to listen to everybody else, and you just get a mishmash. You get just a soup sandwich, as we used to say a long time ago. You get a mess.
I understand.
So you get the very thing you complain about.
And that's, again, why I'd like to see the Catholic Church and other faiths reassert its own moral authority over its own flock. I mean,
because the Catholic Church leadership has accepted the point of view that America got it right, that we have religious liberty, that the conscience rules, that your conscience, however you want to have it, rules, and they don't want to enforce their own discipline. Because if the leaders of the Catholic Church enforce their own discipline on matters of doctrine and morals, guess what's going to happen? They're going to be attacked in 1,000 ways to Sunday, and they know that. And these guys don't have the faith, the leadership doesn't have the faith, and they don't have the courage to suffer for the faith. It's really that simple.
No, I mean, look, I think in the pre-Courtney Murray loose days, Cuomo would have been excommunicated in 2 seconds, and of course, in the pre-Martin Luther days, he would have been burned at the stake. So,
well, let me tell you, you're absolutely right, and let me tell you something. The point of view of Mario Cuomo when he made that big statement in 1984, about I'm privately opposed to abortion, but I'm publicly in favor of it. That came out of September of 1960, a speech by a Jesuit by the name of Gus Weigel, who was a good friend of John Courtney Murray. He made a speech in Washington, D.C. at the Basilica, at the heart of Catholicism in the United States, and he said, Catholic politicians lead a double life. We believe in one thing, but we have to go with the other thing, which is not in accordance with our faith. And that sent the message to all the Catholic corners of the United States and of the world that politicians can be two-faced. The Catholic politicians don't have to live in accordance with the faith. They don't have to try to implement the Catholic faith. And that went all throughout the Catholic world and throughout the rest of the world because the Catholic hierarchy let Weigel say that with impunity. They said nothing in response to it. Nothing. Silence. Just like the Pete Buttigieg bid for defining and redefining religion, which is very interesting. This whole debate between Pence and Buttigieg. Here are two government officials defining the doctrines of Christianity. That's what you get in a liberal society. That's what you get when you have the prayer breakfast. You have the doctrines of religion defined by the politicians.
And also, it was a very famous speech that was delivered at that same time in 1960 by presidential candidate and Catholic John F. Kennedy.
Absolutely correct, Charles.
And he was in Houston, and he said, look, my Catholic faith is personal, and it's not going to influence my support of the U.S. Constitution, which was basically he got the green light to become president of the United States. So
that's spot on.
Yeah. So I mean, your points are very well taken here, and your analysis of why the Catholic hierarchy doesn't enforce its own doctrines on its own flock is right on. I mean, I just briefly want to ask. I feel I have to ask this. What's going on with this whole business of homosexuality in the church and pedophilia and all the rest of that with priests? How can that happen? I mean, I'm speaking here again. I'm not Catholic, but I care about the church. I want to see the church fly right morally because it's a moral arbiter that we all look to. It's a world force of morality, regardless of whether you're Catholic. So how can that happen in the church? How can our Boston Cardinal Bernard Law have been so off the reservation in terms of doing the right thing with that issue?
I'm probably not the best guy to ask about that because I just haven't studied it. I think the fact that you got people who are acting in contravention of the faith and you don't take discipline against them indicates that the leadership once again just doesn't want to enforce its own prerogatives. Why are there so many homosexuals or gays within the church? Some people say it's the tall grass, that it's easy to hide there. I think what you have, though, now in the leadership of the church is an acceptance of the gay identity as a legitimate identity. And so what that signifies is it signifies that, once again, the church leadership is saying to the societal economic elites of the liberal societies, hey, yeah, you guys got it right. We're with you. There's no serious critique of what is the gay identity and what it means. And I think it's more than sodomy. It actually deals more with the issue of gender roles. And, I know I get in trouble for using that word gender, but if you go back to the teachings of Christ and if you look at the Bible, he talks about men and women. He says they're made men and women. Those are the two genders. Those are the two sexes.
That's right. I mean, it goes back to Genesis. God created man and women, he says, in his image. So, yeah, and by the way, when I ask this question, I'm not by any means suggesting that Judaism is some paragon of virtue here. Hardly. So, I mean, these are problems that have infected all of the main
Charles,
faiths.
I believe you're correct. I believe liberalism and the Enlightenment has affected to the detriment of many religions, those religions. It has affected Judaism. It has affected Israel. That's why Israel recently, in July of last year, passed the law saying that it's an ethnic state, essentially. So liberalism or the Enlightenment.
So it's a religious state.
It's to strip people.
Yeah, I mean, it passed a law saying that it is a Jewish state, not necessarily ethnic. Judaism is an ethno-religion. It's not, I mean, you can be a Jew and not be ethnically a Jew, and you're just as much Jewish. And I'd point to the president's daughter as an example. Anyway, David, let my listeners and viewers know where they can get your excellent book.
Well, Amazon.com's got everything, doesn't it, Charles?
It sure does. And I've enjoyed the conversation. I admire what you're doing over there. Maybe we can, I'd like to do follow-ups in the coming months.
That'd be fine.
Thank you very much, David Wemhoff. I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Charles.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Take care now.
All right.
Bye-bye.